So hello everyone. This video is originally a class that I prepared for my labor policy and the law course at the Faculty of Law of the KU Leuven in Belgium. But we thought with my colleagues to also share it to a wider audience to basically spread some knowledge about what kind of regulations governments are putting in place to take care of the emergency caused by the epidemic of COVID-19. Now, of course, this epidemic has had a huge impact on all our lives and of course also on work and employment, which form a very important part of our lives. The scale and the spread of the epidemic is unprecedented, actually. This is an event that we haven't seen since when the Second World War stopped, basically, that the wall of the world is hit by a single event that has so far-reaching effects on all our lives. So some countries have been put in lockdown, so basically no one can go out unless they are involved in emergency or essential activities, and this also has a huge impact on labor markets, of course. And both the measures to contain the contagion, but the disease itself will have huge and long-lasting impacts that at the moment are unforeseeable. What we know is that labor markets are and will be heavily impacted by this. If we look, for instance, at just one country, the United States, to give you an idea of what has been the impact of the epidemic so far, these are the numbers of applications filed for unemployment benefits, and you see that in February and in the first week of March, these applications were very low, and then they skyrocketed in the last part of March, and at the beginning of April they arrive at more than 6 million in a single week. Countries are reacting to this using many possible measures. Some of them are more universal, some of them are destined to people in employment. Today we're gonna mostly cover the employment and social regulation that have been put in place to react to the epidemic and the crisis that followed. So we start with short-time work schemes. So these schemes are basically programs that allow firms to freeze part of their workforce or their entire workforce, partially or totally. So basically, people can be temporarily laid off without being dismissed. So they remain in employment, they keep their jobs, but they don't go to work either totally or for a number of hours they are put in post. And for the part of time that they don't work, they receive an income supplement, normally funded by the government. Now, some of these schemes have long existed in developed labor markets. In Germany, for instance, there's a scheme called Kurzarbeit that has proven to be very successful to manage the last economic and financial crisis of the 2000s. In Italy, for instance, there is a scheme called Cassa Integrazione Guadagni, and this scheme is normally funded by social security contribution paid by employers and workers. So it doesn't immediately bears a cost for the taxpayers. It's paid normally by employers and workers. But of course, in many countries, including in Italy, these programs where they existed have been expanded to take care of the crisis, or have been newly introduced to take care of the crisis. So they have a heavy cost on public finances, and of course they cannot be used for a long period of time before money runs out. The benefits of short-time schemes are Many, they help reduce dismissals in a downturn. They help keeping people in jobs and keeping their income sustained in a way or another. This has both economic benefits because workers have some money to spend and their income is safeguarded, but also some good moral and psychological effects because workers don't lose their jobs, so they don't get unemployed. They know that there will be a job waiting for them after the crisis is over or is reverted. So it's basically a good thing for workers when these short-term schemes work. And of course, it's also very good for employers. For employers, this system provides a lot of flexibility. They are allowed to basically freeze some of their workforce operations, some of their personnel costs. At the same time, they don't disperse the workforce. They don't have to dismiss the workforce, and therefore they can immediately resume production after the crisis averted or when they need to resume production without having to go and hire people mostly untrained in the labor market. So it is a very good thing for both employers and workers. But of course, they also come with some issues. For instance, they are extremely costly, and especially when they have to be, and they had to be, introduced precisely for the crisis, they need to be paid from the scratch by taxpayers' money. And again, this money, as we all know, is not unlimited. Also, many vulnerable workers can find themselves excluded from these schemes. Self-employed workers are typically not covered, but also many temporary workers, casual workers, the platform workers in the gig economy normally are not covered in short-time schemes. So they leave out a good portion of the workforce, an increasing portion of the workforce that is basically left without protection coming from these schemes. Also, short-term schemes can be subject to opportunistic behaviors from employers. Employer may ask for relief even if they wouldn't have fired the people that they put on short-time measures, normally to try to limit the risk of opportunistic behavior and of free riding. Regulation require for a collective agreement to be signed in order to access to the short-term schemes, but this is not always the case, and especially it is not the case for some of the emergency programs that have been put in place, in which basically the requirement for a collective agreement was either minimized or limited or not introduced in the first place. To give you just an idea of the kind of recourse and the spikes in recourse that we see in developed labor markets in recourse to short-term schemes. This is a chart that basically explains the trend of the application for these programs in France. So you see it goes up from from mid-March 2020 up and goes to over many millions of workers and firms at the end of March. Of course, another measure that is useful in times of unprecedented medical crisis is sick pay and emergency pay. Now, many OECD countries, most OECD countries provide for a sick pay program. So people get some payment also when they are sick and they are not allowed to work because in this case, maybe they are hit by the virus and they can't leave home or they can't go to work because they are ill. But we see that even among OECD countries, there's a huge variation in the way sick pay works. Some countries have only a few days of sick pay provided by employers or by public bodies. Some countries have no sick pay at all. This is the case of the United States, for instance. in the United States, as we will see, sick pay was introduced for the first time to take care of this crisis. Also, the level of income that is replaced varies from country to country. Some countries arrive to 100% of the income replaced. Some countries have much lower percentage that people get of their salary when they are on sick leave. Normally, the cost is borne by the state, except for the very first initial days. In many countries, those are borne by the employers. Again, a big problem with sick pay and leave in general is that many workers are not covered by it. Self-employed workers are not normally covered by sick pay schemes, and so also many casual workers and platform workers are excluded by the operation of sick pay. As I said, in some countries, new systems of sick pay were introduced where they were missing. In particular, in the US, the federal government introduced sick pay and care leave up to 12 weeks for the first time in history, even though, as I said, there are many exceptions to this. Italy introduced a new form of care leave, of emergency leave. So basically, if you are a parent and you have kids that cannot go to school because the schools are closed, of course, it's very difficult for you to keep on with your work, either from remote or even more if you have to physically attend your workplace. So you are allowed, according to this scheme, to take up to 15 days off and receive 50% of your salary. And also this has been done in Japan. Again, some of these measures has always been there, and some of them, like the ones I explained for you, the US and Italy, have been introduced to take care of the crisis. Another way in which regulation has been attuned to take care of the crisis is to allow adjustment to annual leaves. So in some countries, employers were allowed by the government to impose workers to take the annual leave they have accrued or they are accruing over this year. So basically, you accrue holidays or you have carried over holidays remaining from last year, and the employer can force you to take these holidays so that basically, at the very least, you keep on being paid, but the employer saves the money of holiday costs. This was allowed, for instance, by the government in Italy, specifically with some decrees, especially for accrued holiday time. And sometimes, in order to accede to short-time schemes, you are required to use holiday first. So basically, before going on being financed by public money, employers are required to ensure that workers use all of their annual leave or some part of their accrued annual leave before, again, they accede to public funding. This has been done, for instance, in Italy. This is the general regulation for short-term schemes, but this has been relaxed for some short-term schemes that were introduced to take care of the epidemic. In Denmark, instead, a collective agreement on short-term arrangements provided that in order to accede to the short-term scheme, the workers have to give up 5 days of their annual leave. So again, they contribute to the effort by giving up some of their paid leave time. Some countries have frozen dismissals, so basically they have limited or eliminated the possibility to fire people. So far, up to the beginning of April 2020, France, Italy, and Spain adopted these measures. For instance, in Italy, all collective redundancy procedures were suspended, and all individual dismissals for economic reasons, so not the ones for disciplinary reasons, of course, but the ones for economic reasons, have also been suspended for 2 months, starting in March 2020. Now, to give you an idea of how unprecedented is the crisis, the last time the Italian government approved a measure like this was 1946, after the Second World War. In France also, and this is something very positive, because dismissal frees normally only benefit people with permanent contract. People with temporary contracts that expire are left out of the protection. France actually introduced a protection for temporary workers. Their contract during the epidemic is prolonged, so the time of the epidemic doesn't count against their contract. So their contract is basically prolonged for the time of the emergency. Another very important measure is the facilitation of remote work, telework for people that don't have to basically attend physically the workplace. And some people have the privilege of being able to work from home, but we will see that this is not easy even when this is possible. And for some workers, of course, this is completely impossible. If you think of people working in retail, in factories, etc., etc., smart work, remote work, telework is simply not an option. But when there is an option for that, governments we've seen have introduced some mechanisms to incentivize and facilitate recourse to remote work, to allow people working from home using their laptops, their computer, etc., etc. So, for instance, Japan has introduced a subsidy to subsidize the cost of installing teleworking facility. Italy, that normally requires an agreement, a collective and an individual agreement to put people in remote work, basically with a decree waived this requirement, so a collective agreement or an individual agreement is no longer needed, and the employer can decide to unilaterally put people in remote work. France is also encouraging small and medium enterprises to, instead of acceding to short-term schemes, to use a special fund to allow for online training. So this can be seen as a form of remote work, loosely speaking. Now, of course, remote work is something good. It allows some businesses to operate even during this time in which everyone is encouraged not to leave home or is forced not to leave home. But of course, this is not a panacea. First of all, going to remote work in general, so passing from physical attendance to remote work for the whole of the workforce is never smooth, especially if it needs to be done from one day to the next or from 1 week to the next. So the operation is not always easy. And also we have seen that many occupational safety and health requirements and data protection requirements have not been taken care of because of the emergency. So there are data protection issue regarding the information that the worker exchanged, maybe using their own personal laptop and integrating the programs that the employers use for their businesses. But also, it is not the same to work from your home office and work at your office if you don't have a good chair, a good desk. So there's also occupational health and safety issues that have come to exist. At the same time, some people have the unrealistic expectation that worker can work from remote as if nothing was happening, as if we were in a business as usual situation. So you hear even managers and employers saying that this can be used as a productivity boost. We have seen this in many universities, for instance. And of course, this is not the case because this is not a business as usual situation. Many people have to live in crowded apartments and take care of children or of other people that cannot take care of themselves during the epidemic. If they have to go to shop, they have to queue for many hours sometimes to get into a supermarket. So this is not business as usual. And sometimes the expectation is that if you put people on remote work, they can work as if we weren't living in a situation of emergency. So this is a very important issue. Another important issue is the introduction of emergency occupational safety and health rules and regulations that are specifically designed to deal with the pandemic and that adapt to the already existing occupational safety and health measures. Some of the specific ones could be, for instance, concerning the need for social distancing, for instance, in supermarkets, in retail shops, but also in offices, or in factories, if it is not possible to work from home. The obligation or even the right to wear masks and protective gear. So sometimes the employers don't want people to wear masks protecting themselves because this can have a sort of image impact. So sometimes they discourage that. Sometimes therefore, you need to fight to basically wear your protective gear. Sometimes the social partners have concluded specific collective agreements in order to take care of particular situations in which there is an occupational health and safety risk that is basically increased by the pandemic. So, for instance, this happened in Spain for workers in the supermarket sector, and also it happened in Belgium. Now, again, once you introduce new regulation, that doesn't mean that the regulation is gonna be enforceable and enforced by itself, and especially this is true in a period of crisis like this. There's a lack of inspectors. Basically, there's no labor inspectorates operating at the moment in many cases. Sometimes, even when protective gear is given to the workers, this is inadequate, or it is impossible to find good protective materials. And sometimes some workers are even excluded from the obligation to be provided protective materials. So, for instance, in Italy, we had a very recent injunction issued from a judge that ordered a platform that operates food delivery to at the very least, give to their riders some protective gear, some masks and some gloves, for instance. So you see, you even need, in a time of this, like this, you need a judge that intervenes because some employers or some businesses don't provide with this protective gear for people that are still at work. Some countries have expanded unemployment benefits, so the sum that people get when they are unemployed. In many cases, specific provision had to be taken in order to extend unemployment benefits to the self-employed, which in many cases are excluded normally by unemployment. But again, many self-employed people became unemployed because of the crisis. So you had to expand all these. And of course, also these are a very big cost on public funding. In some cases, the duration of the benefit has been increased, or even the income, the amount of the benefit has been increased. And this, for instance, happened in the UK, in the USA. Still, again, this is very important. Some workers, and especially the platform workers and casual workers, fall through the cracks. So new regulation is put in place to extend protection to people that are not normally covered, but the way it is drafted, it leaves outside protection some of the most vulnerable workers that are still out there. Other measures are more general, don't only regard people in employment. For instance, there's the possibility to introduce one-off payments. The United States, for instance, introduced a one-off payment of $1,200 in cash paid to everyone who makes up to $75,000, and then it decreases when their income goes over $75,000. In Italy, the government has approved a lump sum that is given every month per 3 months to self-employed workers, and this sum amounts to €600. In the UK, some self-employed workers were given a taxable grant of up to 2,500 pounds for up to 3 months. These again, according to Bog and Ford, has left outside some of the most vulnerable self-employed out there. The casual workers and the vulnerable self-employed are not included in the scheme, or risk to be excluded from this. Some countries also introduce rent relief, or they have deferred mortgages or suspended evictions. And in some cases, to keep businesses operating in a time of crisis, the government has funded or guaranteed some loans to businesses, and especially small and medium enterprises. But in general, we see that loans have been actually also being introduced for businesses in general. The US and Switzerland are an example of countries that introduce these loans for, especially for small and medium enterprises. As I said many times, the crisis has hit particularly the most precarious workers. As I said, people like the dependent self-employed, people working for platforms, people in casual employment, in short, in 0 hours contract, in on-demand jobs, in on-call jobs, they have been left outside protection in many cases. Sometimes they're excluded from sick pay, they are excluded from short-time schemes, and also sometimes from unemployment benefits. They can be basically, their contract can be discontinued at will by the employers normally, so the employer is allowed to terminate the contract with a self-employed without giving any reason. Normally you need a reason to terminate an employment contract, but this is not always the case for the self-employed. Or for casual workers or platform workers, if a business wants to end the arrangement or end the payment, they just have to zero down or to delog the people from the platforms and don't offer shifts anymore. And we have seen that many workers have suffered the brunt of the crisis, and this and the crisis has had a very disparate implication on the most vulnerable workers. When they have to work because they don't have an alternative between working and starving, they often have to basically go to work even if they're sick, and therefore they could be contagious, or when their conditions of work are unsafe. And as I told you, in Italy, we had to have an injunction from a judge to order a platform to give masks to platform workers. Another part of the economy that has been, in some cases, excluded from protection is the informal economy. Informal workers are normally don't have access to social and employment protection by definition, and therefore they, in many cases, don't have access to all of these or most of the provisions that we have seen so far. They certainly are not entitled normally to sick pay or to accede to short-time schemes, etc., etc. A very important part of the workers that have been affected are also domestic workers and care workers. Again, households have, in many cases, discontinued the work arrangement, discontinued the payment. Of course, some virtuous households kept on paying the domestic workers, but this has not always been the case. And again, domestic workers in many cases are excluded by many very important protection. For instance, the protection in short-term schemes normally don't apply to domestic workers. So this is something that every one of us can do, help the domestic workers that always help us running our lives. And we see that actually how important their work is now that we don't have access to their work. So everyone should do something to help domestic workers who are really bearing a big part of the brunt of this crisis. To give you a sort of breakdown of what is happening for precarious workers, I'm using a pioneering study, really an impressive study carried out by Adam, Prussels, Boneva, Goling, and Raoult that was just published on April 2020 on mapping the inequality in the impact of the coronavirus. Basically, you will see, if you look the figure more closely, that the people that are most impacted are the self-employed, the temporary workers, the people that don't choose their own work schedules. Those are the people that have been bearing most of the brunt of the crisis. So I really encourage you to go and look at this paper from these authors called Inequality in the Impact of the Coronavirus Shock, New Survey Evidence from the UK, April 1, 2020. Now, going to the conclusions, I think that something that we don't have to forget is that this crisis has made even more clear the impact of the managerial prerogatives of employers in businesses and in our society more at large. Of course, employers enjoy a very good deal of managerial prerogatives of direct the workforce, of controlling and monitoring the workforce, on disciplining the workforce, and on making their business operating. This is the case basically in every country in the world. And this has had a very important impact during the crisis. Employers had the possibility, especially initially, to decide whether the business was to consider essential or not, so whether to require two people to go to work or not. This has been the source of a very big quarrel in Italy with unions, basically threatening the general strike if the list of essential activities had not been narrowed down by the government. Also, employers were able to decide whether to allow or not remote work, whether to allow or to impose the use of paid holidays, whether to discontinue precarious workers, whether to dismiss people, or to apply for short-term schemes. And this is even more the case for the emergency short-time schemes, in which no collective agreement is required to enjoy the scheme. So I think this is something to consider. Once the epidemic is over, we should all think about the extent of the managerial prerogatives that the employer have running businesses and our societies more at large. Coming to the end, I think we see a strong risk of deregulation after the end of the peak of the epidemic. There's already many businesses and institutions that are calling to relax employment protections, employment legislations, to loosen it down, to deregulate. For instance, the OECD has asked us to consider to relax rules about temporary work contracts to make theoretically people more easy to hire after the peak of the crisis. In Australia, some employers associations have asked to be exempted from unfair dismissals claim at the end of the crisis. So basically to not to have to pay any remedy if they have fired people without valuable reasons. And also some of the platforms in the gig economy are lobbying to remove some of the protective regulation that have been put in place in the last few years, in the last few months, in some countries, and notably in Italy and in the US, where we have seen important pieces of legislation passed in order to protect platform workers. Many platforms are now asking to remove this, using the crisis as an excuse to remove protection. Now, I think this deserves a lot of attention. I'm not saying that employment regulation adjustment should be a taboo, but I think that we have to also be very careful that this is not the opportunity to reconsider and to basically re-amend all the labor regulation because of the crisis without any actual evidence that we need this regulation. Now, if we look at what happened in the past, and especially what happened in the last financial crisis, we see that there is no evidence that a relaxation of employment protection legislation has had any good impact on macroeconomic outcomes. basically we don't have evidence that in all the countries in which there has been many important flexibilization and deregulation of the labor market, in particular in Mediterranean countries, these has really had an impact on macroeconomic outcomes. We have actually seen that countries that have strong social institution, and particularly, for instance, functioning industrial relations system and functioning short time schemes, such as Germany with their Kurzarbeit, fared better than others in taking care of the crisis. Also, we should not forget that in many countries, after the economic and financial crisis that hit Europe and part of the Western world, including the US, in the early 2010s, so 2010, 11, 12, well, in these years, many reforms have already reduced protection against unfair dismissal, relaxed regulation on hiring temporary workers, on making recourse to agency work. And we have seen the casual and vulnerable self-employed are already on the rise. So it is really debatable whether we need even more reforms to go in this direction. Actually, what we have learned from this crisis is that the precarious workers are the ones that are most hit by the crisis, and therefore in the long term are also the ones that basically will increase, and it's not their fault of course, but the public finances will be impacted by the fact that many workers don't have the means to take care of themselves because they are in very precarious contracts or because they are excluded from very important employment protection programs. And also when people are forced to work during a pandemic because they don't have an alternative between work and starvation, this is never good for anyone. So these are my last remarks. I thank you all very much for your attention.